Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to join me. So for introductions, I'm Gabrielle Jarrell. I am the board chair for North Carolina Normal. I'm also the co-founder of ACT, the organization we work with together. With me today, I have Morgan Davis, who is a cannabis business lawyer based here in North Carolina and the founder of Davis Legal. So thank you so much for having this conversation.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. I love talking about all things cannabis, especially all things criminal in cannabis.
Oh my gosh, it's so interesting. And I think one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is that even though public perception has shifted so much surrounding the topic of marijuana, legislation has not moved nearly as quickly as public opinion. It's becoming slightly more casual in like family settings. People are kind of opening up. And I think with that comes a decrease in the level of, I don't want to say severity, but like the category that individuals would put it in. People are less scared of it, right? It's a little bit more open. It's a little bit more casual. Being that we're both in North Carolina, we know that North Carolina has implemented some efforts to decriminalize in a sense, or to deprioritize marijuana, but it is still very much illegal. In a majority of instances, the severity of the penalty for possession of marijuana is often directly related to the amount that someone might have on them. I just wanted to know if you could expand a little bit more on how weight impacts charges and what that might look like for someone arrested for possession.
Yeah, the three factors that go into determining how severe someone's punishment will be is correct. Number one factor is weight. Less than half an ounce is a class 3 misdemeanor. So North Carolina criminal statutes, a criminal offense is categorized by either misdemeanor or felony. And then within each of those categories is different levels. So felonies go from a class A felony to class I felony. Class A being the things you would think about: murder, worst of criminal offenses. Class I being slightly above misdemeanor offenses. And then when you're in misdemeanors, you go from a class A1 to a class 3. So when we talk about what North Carolina has done for decrim, it's not that they've decriminalized or even really deprioritized. What they've done is, it used to be that possession of marijuana and possession of marijuana paraphernalia, or in general, possession of drug paraphernalia, used to both be class 1 misdemeanors. Now they're both class 3 misdemeanors, and you should not a judge cannot sentence you to jail for conviction of those offenses unto themselves. You can be sentenced to jail if in combination with other offenses, and you can certainly, and this is the misleading point, you can certainly still be arrested on those offenses. So just because a judge can't sentence you to jail doesn't mean a police officer can't arrest you. So less than half an ounce is a class 3 misdemeanor. It's what we call the lowest level misdemeanor. It is still a criminal conviction that goes on your record. Anything that is between half an ounce and 1.5 ounces is a class 1 misdemeanor. Anything above 1.5 ounces is a felony. And then felony level is determined based on, again, by weight, whether it's felony possession or felony possession with intent to sell and distribute. And there are a number of factors that go into determining where you fall in those categories. So one is weight. The second is type. So flower versus resin. You can possess a lot more flower than you can resin and still be in a misdemeanor category. Resin, and the statutes refer to it generally as hashish, even though when we're talking about hashish in the community and in the social aspect, hashish and resin are two very different things, right? And now these days, the number of types of resin is huge. It's so wide and varied. But you should know that if you are pulled over and searched and they find resin on you, if it falls in any of the categories, shake, shatter, whatever.
Cartridges is very popular. Does cartridges count as resin, or is that a different category?
Cartridges should not count as resin. As resin, it's an extract, and there is some the issue there is what is the DA going to consider it? Like, probably an officer is going to treat it the same thing as resin, but the amounts don't really measure up, right? And the statute, one thing to argue is that because the statute specifically references hashish and vape juice are obviously, or an extract are obviously very, very different. And so there is an argument to be made there, but nonetheless, if it is above the federal legal limit and above North Carolina's limit for THC, then you're looking at criminal action, and they will most likely treat your extract like resin because there's not a specific statute on point.
Right. Well, and in a state where it's, for a lot of enforcement officers, hard to tell the difference between CBD or traditional THC marijuana or what have you, I can imagine that there's a lot of kind of gray area in there.
Oh man, I mean, imagine so we as a community, those of us who are in the cannabis community, we're super familiar with all the different types of products out there. But even I and you, we're learning new things every day. So imagine you're a law enforcement officer who all of your training says anything that looks like marijuana, smells like marijuana, is marijuana, and is about that limited, doesn't include a full education on the gamut of products that now exist, both on the high and low THC side, right? So they're really at a very significant disadvantage in coming up against these products, unless they are, through their own personal lives, familiar with it.
With that, I did have a follow-up question with that, is that if I've heard stories of individuals being pulled over having CBD, hemp, or like delta derivative type of products, and that's still being an issue. Are there field tests? How, like, if someone is pulled over and there's an assumption that they have marijuana products and they are making the argument that they don't, what are usually the next steps? Like, is someone arrested? Is it a testing thing?
So it can go a couple of different ways. If a product is labeled as hemp or CBD, the conversation should really end there. If it doesn't, the officer is going to have to, in court, eventually show some reason to believe that product is not what the person says it is. But let's say it's not labeled, and let's say it can go a number of ways. They can get a ticket. An officer can choose to just write them a ticket and let them go, probably confiscate the material, whatever it may be. They can arrest them, and they can try and search their vehicle for more. And that can be the precursor to whatever they find in that search. When it goes to court, question is whether or not the state is going to pay to have that product, whatever it may be, tested to prove definitively whether or not it is in fact marijuana under North Carolina law. A lot of times these days, they're not going to waste the money unless it's a felony. If it's a misdemeanor, they're not going to waste the money to do the testing because it's quite expensive and it can take a long time. They may choose to try the case and just prove it based on a totality of the circumstances. And in that case, we've seen a lot of success in defense attorneys making arguments that under the statute and based on a memo by the State Bureau of Investigation that specifically states hemp and marijuana look the exact same. They smell the exact same. There is no standalone looking, smelling experience that's going to say to an officer definitively, this is marijuana and not hemp. It has to be tested, or they have to have a judge would have to find that there were other circumstances to lead them to believe that. And if you've got someone saying, no, this is hemp CBD, this is where I got it, this is how it's labeled, or this is why it's not labeled, there would obviously be a lot of evidence weighing against the state in that case.
Thank you so much. Stepping back, also, you had mentioned the potential charge for like paraphernalia if someone were to
Yep.
search your car. I find this fascinating personally because smoke shops are everywhere. They sell various paraphernalia products, and I've always wondered how the hell they can do that just kind of openly, knowing full stuff, or like I feel like most people knowing full well what these items are potentially being used for. Now, objectively, hemp, CBD, there are smokables that is a potential. But could you tell me more about paraphernalia charge? Is this just something if you have cones or rolls or a bowl or a glass piece or something to that effect? Is it automatic? Do you have to have it and the drugs that are being used with it?
So it depends. It used to be, so that the offense used to be called possession of drug paraphernalia. And when that was the case, pretty much the paraphernalia unto itself, even just a Ziploc baggie, right, was enough to charge someone if there were other circumstances to believe that there were controlled substances present at any given time. And so I have had clients years ago who were charged with a Ziploc baggie with shake in it. So we're talking like crumbs, right? And it's been like sitting in their back seat under their passenger side for 2 years because they haven't cleaned out their car. We're seeing a lot less of that. They've changed the statute to possession of marijuana paraphernalia. And there's still possession of drug paraphernalia for other things such as needles, pipes, anything that can be used for ingestion of other controlled substances. But when it comes to marijuana, it's there, you're going to need something more. So whether it's smell, whether it's ash, whether, it's actually finding some sort of substance in whatever the paraphernalia is, its location in proximity to remnants or evidence of a controlled substance. There has to be more than just the pipe itself, especially these days, because there are so many products that are not controlled that can be used with these types of paraphernalia.
It's good to know. I feel like, especially for individuals that I've seen people with like glass collections and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm like, wow, yeah, right, exactly. So some slight pivot to growing. Now, I feel like for the average cannabis consumer, this is kind of a far out there topic. I don't think it's something that a lot of people consider, but a lot of folks that have been kind of waiting in the balance for a medical program,
right,
in order to ensure that they are getting access to the medicine they believe they need, have taken that step, which seems severe, seems like it could get you in a lot more trouble. So I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of what are the differences between simply possessing versus growing.
Yeah, so just like you said earlier, while North Carolina has taken steps to lower the penalty for some marijuana offenses, it's still very illegal here, and enforcement is still a big issue. I have clients getting charged left, right, and center for possessing the amount that they use for their own medicinal purposes. People who would be exempted under SB 711, which is currently sitting and waiting to be passed. People who operate in legal states who are just driving through, get caught and are charged here. So there's not a lack of enforcement. On the federal level, there's a different conversation to be had. But in North Carolina, at the state level, there is not a lack of enforcement. So growing for yourself, one, we're talking about, when we talk about how things are weighed, if you think about flour being weighed at less than half an ounce or up to an ounce and a half, and above an ounce and a half, it's a felony. A plant is obviously going to put you smack dab in felony land, right? Even if you're just growing in your own house for yourself, just a small grow operation in your closet puts you in the land of felonies in North Carolina. And so I understand why people cultivate, and and we see this a lot. Like we see across the United States as cannabis has become legalized, whether medically or recreationally, we see people taking the step to take matters into their own hands and start growing and participating well in advance of the law. That is not unusual. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to get in trouble. It doesn't mean you're not going to get arrested. And oftentimes what happens is, let's say you have a small grow operation in your greenhouse or in your house somewhere. And one night, one of your children has a terrible asthma attack and you have to call 911, right? And the ambulance arrives, police arrive with the ambulance because they always do. And lo and behold, in their surveying of the scene to assist your child, they find your very small grow. And now, not only are you looking at potentially being charged with a felony for possession of marijuana, or potentially, depends on how much you have, possession with intent to sell and deliver, you might be charged with child abuse for having it in your home and have social services called and your child taken from you for a short period of time. That's what we see a lot of times, is people who aren't doing anything wrong, but life circumstances bring the police into their home and they get in trouble.
Yeah, no, and that's a great example. There was a teacher a couple of years ago in Brunswick County that was a beloved, I think it was a math teacher. I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to misspeak. But it was a similar thing. A house fire brought police and fire trucks to their home where they discovered a grow. And I was always curious because they said the weight, it was like 25 pounds that this person supposedly had. And all I imagined was officers literally like ripping plants out of the ground, completely hydrated, like roots and all, and getting thrown onto a scale. And it's like, oh boy, that's life. So a question that I had about something that you mentioned was intent to distribute or intent to sell. How is it an assumed charge, something that they can tack on based on judgments that they're making in the moment? Or I guess how do they, because it sounds like they don't have to catch you in the act of distributing and selling it, yeah. You're just being charged with the intent. So how does intent play into it? How do they come to that formulation?
Yeah, possession with intent to sell and deliver is based on the amount that you possess. So more than what they've determined to be considered a personal use amount, plus evidence of having a scale or having a lot of cash on you or having a Ziploc, like a container of Ziploc baggies. Any of these additional sort of paraphernalia items can lead an officer to make the argument for probable cause to arrest and charge you with possession with intent to sell and deliver.
Thank you for that clarity. Under what circumstances do people most often get arrested for possession? I imagine the cops showing up to your house and the fire trucks and the ambulances are few and far between. Is there like a common thread under or common set of circumstances?
Oh yeah, traffic stops. And it's funny, I just had a conversation last week with a Superior Court judge who was saying, who is by no means a typical proponent of legalization, but who said to me, we must do something different. We must legalize this stuff simply for the fact that enforcement we're spending so much money on enforcement. He'd spent the previous week in what we call probation violations, right? And so he spent an entire week listening to situations where people on probation had violated their probation. And a lot of the issues that came up were people who had either tested positive for THC, or they'd gotten additional charges based on traffic stops. And you don't even have to look at probation violations to see this. You can see it all over any courthouse you go to. The most common circumstance that you're going to see is where somebody was stopped for any number of normal traffic related offenses. At any given time, most of us are committing a traffic offense. We're either not signaling when we change lanes, or we're speeding, or our registration's out, or something. So they're pulled over. And then upon pulling over, an officer smells marijuana, right? And that leads to a search. And that search might show up with marijuana or marijuana paraphernalia, or it might not. But that is far and above the most common circumstance in which people are going to encounter police officers and then find themselves in trouble for marijuana related offenses.
So if there could just be one recommendation of like, don't smoke in your car, which I know it's easier said than done for a lot of people. I get that, but that's just it, is that if that's kind of like the common thread. Okay. Scenario, if someone is pulled over and the officer that approaches their car then says, I believe I smell marijuana, can I search your vehicle? What do you say?
Yeah, so you have the right to say no. You absolutely have the right not to consent to a search. It's up to you. And a common response, the first time you say no from an officer, a very common response is going to be, well, I smell marijuana. If you tell me where it is, I'll just write you a ticket. But if you make me search for it, if you make me call a dog here and do a sniff, or you make me go get a warrant, I'm going to arrest you. And for a lot of people, that's enough incentive to just say, okay, here's my pen, here's my, little bit of whatever I have. Because the idea of getting a ticket versus going to jail and having to bond out and having to leave your car on the side of the road. If you've got your kids in the car, they're going to leave your kids in the car. If you've got your dog in the car, they're going to leave your dog in the car. They will not do anything to remove them. If you get lucky, you might have an officer ready to come before they arrest you. So it's a very scary proposition, and a lot of people will just sort of either consent or give it up. But you don't have to. Under any circumstances, you do not have to consent. You have to provide them with your license and registration upon asking, because you're driving a vehicle. Other than that, you can choose not to answer pretty much any questions other than your name and where you're going, which you don't even really have to answer that.
But to say, is that your legal advice? Or do you have any legal advice for someone in that instance?
So obviously I can't give general legal advice because, because every situation is different, and you have to decide for yourself. But I would say that, if you find yourself in a situation, don't make it worse by divulging everything. And preserve all of your own rights and protect yourself by just saying politely, here's my license and registration. I decline to answer any further questions. You have the right to do that. And then it's on the officer to do their job and either get a dog to come and do a sniff, and in which case they'll have enough probable cause to search, or they can choose to arrest you right there. Which is a big deal. I'm not negating that by any means. But if you choose to consent, or you choose to basically, quote unquote, confess by handing something over, then you've given up the ability for me or any other criminal defense attorney to make a good argument in court, potentially.
That was actually going to be my follow-up. So in this theoretical, you've been arrested, you go to jail. Legally, what are your next steps? What would you advise someone who's experiencing this, arrested for possession, guilty or not, to be their next step?
Yeah, so the next step is, once you've bonded out, hopefully you've been able to bond out, then hire an attorney or ask for a public defender at your first appearance, whatever you're able to do, and immediately start talking to them about what your potential defenses are.
So I think North Carolina is in a little bit of a unique situation right now, because as we know, Virginia has legalized.
Right.
I love these air quotes, because it's like adult possession, no longer illegal, no sales, medical part. It's this, and like the gray market, I've heard or I've read, is thriving because there's not a ton of capacity or interest. in cracking down, and there's a market to be met because adult use is legal. With the expectation that adult use sales are probably going to start in the next couple of years. So within the next couple of years, you'll be able to drive to Virginia and to go into what's effectively an Apple store and buy cannabis products.
Correct.
The topic of bordering, right? So you go across, you buy it, you bring it home.
Right.
Is it simple possession? What are the implications of potentially bringing cannabis from a legal state back to an illegal state if you're caught with it?
So the second you cross over state lines, you've also violated federal law. And as we know, marijuana is still illegal on the federal level, or high THC cannabis. We're using, normally we've talked about the fact that we like to use the word cannabis and should use the word cannabis, but by law, marijuana is still the term of art. So that's why we're using it today. But so the second that you cross over state lines, you have violated federal law. So you could be charged federally. Again, it's going to be the amount that you are bordering with, and what else you have on you that determines the level of what you're charged with. But yes, if you bring a controlled substance into North Carolina, sorry about that, into North Carolina from another state, even if it's legal in that state, it's illegal here. So the second you cross state lines, you violated North Carolina law.
And yeah, and federal law, because I don't think a lot of individuals are thinking about that. I think the assumption is that if you go there, you bring it back, you get busted here, it's simple possession. When if it can be proven that you brought it in from another state, that it is then a felony.
Yeah, and whether or not the federal government, whether or not the U.S. Attorney's Office would choose to take that case is completely dependent on where you are, and the federal government under the Attorney General and has and the DEA and all the arms of law enforcement have really, they truly have deprioritized marijuana enforcement. It doesn't mean, and as we saw, President Biden pardoned many people with existing simple possession of marijuana convictions recently. And so all of those things combined would signal that unless something else was going on, for example, you were in possession of multiple firearms, or you were trafficking in tobacco, or any other number of reasons, it would be unlikely that the federal government would choose to take that case. Maybe if it was a very large amount, but you certainly still have violated federal law and state law.
While we are on the topic of things that people don't take seriously enough, I think I mentioned this, NORML gets a lot of messages of like, I'm going to bring back a pre-roll in my carry-on from California, or from how much trouble could I get into? And I feel like anecdotally, the understanding is like, oh, TSA doesn't care. I don't know where people learn that. Reddit is full of that. TSA doesn't care. I don't know what the hell that means.
Yeah.
It sounds like TSA cares, but I would love to get your thoughts, because that also sounds federal, or that has like some additional implications that maybe people aren't considering.
Oh, well, I mean, 100%. I mean, the second that you enter an airport and you're flying, and you're flying, most likely you are flying out of your own state, right? You are violating federal law, and TSA does care. They will confiscate your stuff. Whether or not they have you arrested or have an officer then come and charge you is based on the TSA officer, right? Like that's based on the office that you're dealing with. But they will absolutely confiscate your product. They might blacklist you, which means they put your name on a little list, which guarantees that forever you will be searched and probably taken into one of those little rooms and asked a lot of questions. And if you take it into, and certainly they can call the local police and have you charged locally. But also, if you take it into a country, I have had clients that did this, you take it into a country where you're not supposed to have it, you're then dealing with that country. And so, we all saw the news in the past 8 months where, and I can't remember her name right now.
Brittany Griner.
Exactly. Thank you. Was arrested in Russia. I mean, we're not talking about a massive amount of cannabis that she took with her. It was a personal use amount of cannabis in vape cartridges. And a lot of people reacted with, well, she must have had more, or there must have been other circumstances, or this, that, or the other. And yet
in Russia.
Right. I mean, they're very anti-cannabis, and there are lots of countries that are still like that. And even in Thailand, which has truly decriminalized it, they have said very specifically, do not come here and treat us like, the hottest new cannabis tourism spot. It's not legal to sell here yet. We're not encouraging that, and we don't want you doing that. And so if you go there and you end up with the wrong police officer or with the wrong agent, you're going to find yourself sitting in a Thai jail. And that's not going to be fun for anybody.
No, this doesn't sound like a particularly nice way to start or end a vacation, if any.
No. And so I completely agree with you. The proliferation of cannabis and the success of the industry, which we're all very excited about and encouraging of, has led a lot of people to let their guard down and to not take it seriously. And there's some privilege built into that, right? So there's a big difference between if I drive down the street and roll down my window while I vape my pen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And members of my community that are Black or Hispanic who do the same thing, the statistics are clear. I'm probably not going to get pulled over, but they have a much higher chance of getting pulled over. And that's a whole other side of this that continues to be a serious issue, and has been part of this injustice for so long. That has not gone away. And unfortunately, the popularity and the growing success of the industry has, I think, led a lot of people to forget that.
It's such I don't want to say interesting, because in all actuality, like, it's just like you were saying, the circumstances are really devastating. But it's a very odd situation, because it's also nuanced to the point where it's like, depending on who you are, your skin color, as a white presenting woman, I'm very unlikely to have to deal with those circumstances, right? But it's dependent on your circumstances. It's dependent on the officer you get, law enforcement or TSA or otherwise. There's all of these factors that would have to work out really well in your favor in order for you to not have to deal with the kind of resounding negative consequences. But there's so much of that that's out of individuals' control. And if they're dropping their guard, as so many individuals are. I mean, I think Blackish on ABC did an episode about the parents doing edibles. There are jokes on Saturday Night Live. Like, weed is kind of making its way into popular culture, even in that type of like light experimental perspective. And I'm just so glad we were able to have this conversation, because I think a lot of people could use a refresher of some of the implications.
Yeah, and I completely understand that if you're an advocate, if you're a user, you want to be able to feel free and comfortable. And I want you to feel free and comfortable too. However, that's not where we are yet, especially in North Carolina. And I feel so terrible when people come to me and they've been charged and they're like, but I smoke all the time, and everybody I know smokes, and everybody I know, takes cannabis, and why is this such a big deal still? And they seem shocked or disappointed or somehow disenchanted with the idea that the criminal justice system still views them as a person committing a crime, and treats them accordingly. which is a horrible way to be treated, and nobody enjoys the process. And I feel terrible for those people, and I can say nothing to them, but this is the way that it is.
Call your representative.
Call your
That's always our
representative.
response.
Yeah, don't just listen, everybody. Don't just use cannabis. Go advocate for cannabis. Go actually make them legalize it and decriminalize it. Don't assume that just because it's easy for you, that therefore it's good enough, right?
Right. Well, and I love the idea of like casual community activism as well. I smoke. Everyone I know smokes. Okay. Rally the people that you know to be having more of these conversations, because I genuinely believe that if we had the capacity, we could probably go door to door, like just petition it, and technically legalize faster, unfortunately, than the GA could, if it was based solely off of public opinion, or if we had the option to do ballot initiatives. We are at that place, but because there is such a stigma surrounding the conversation, so many folks still feel so uncomfortable. So this is very valuable. I love being able to have a conversation in like an open setting.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think if we could do a voter referendum or a ballot initiative in this state,
oh, done and dusted. It would be done.
We would be legalized at this point. I mean, like I said, when I'm having a conversation in open court with a Superior Court judge who is staunchly Republican and very like old school when it comes to criminal justice, saying we have to legalize marijuana because the amount of money we're spending on enforcement is insane for something that is legal in all over the country, it's time.
Well past due. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I always love talking to you.
Thank you.